the time. My name is Bridget Murphy. I'm a shamanic healer and a teacher, and I run extensive one-on-one programs for people who are ready to dive in to do healing work. And I also offer live group trainings, as well as run a Path to Power online membership community to help people to connect more deeply with spirit. It's a little bit about me. I come on every Wednesday to the best of my ability, right around noon, to talk about a different aspect of healing or a different aspect of healing that has to do specifically with healers. And I call it Healers and Healing. I come on for about 15 or 20 minutes, try to keep it short and power-packed with helpful information. Recently, I talked about, on Healers and Healing, I talked about key elements of shamanic healing. I did a segment on extraction work. I did a segment on soul retrieval. And today I'm going to talk about ancestral healing. Hey there, everyone. Hey, Anne. Hey, Lisa. Good to see you. Today I'm going to talk about ancestral healing because it's a part of the shamanic work that comes through when I help people, or when I am aiming to restore balance. Any well-trained shamanic healer or shamanic practitioner it taps in and does healing work as part of the work. A little about shamanic practice. Shaman is someone who goes into an altered state to meet the spirits that live in the spirit world, to bring back information for people, for communities, and for the world. Shamanic practice has its roots in First Peoples in different regions all over the planet. We are really noticing a surge in the desire to understand shamanic practice right now on the planet, and that's because there's deep, deep medicine and healing in those practices, and we need that now more than we've ever needed that before, ever. So there's a lot to learn, and a lot of people are learning and absorbing. And I've been on this path for over 20 years, learning and absorbing and working with my teachers. So I feel really excited to be able to share this with you. So shamanic practice aims to restore balance. Shamanic healing aims to restore balance and power as well. And it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not a one-and-done thing. You don't just go to a shamanic practitioner and they do a session with you and it looks like every other session and boom, it's done. It doesn't work that way. Spirit doesn't come through in that way. It'd be great if it did, but it doesn't. We look at the spirit world. We look at the spirits, specific spirits, that sometimes take the shape of animal spirits, sometimes take the shape and come through in forms of ancestor spirits, spirits of the land. We look to the spirits and they help us to get what I like to call the bird's eye view, the bigger picture. Shamanic practice, the spirits help us to know when something is out of alignment on all levels: physical level, emotional level, spiritual level. And sometimes it's not easy to know what is out of order or what happened first. That's why we leave it to spirit, and spirit shows us what's going to be the most helpful in order to restore power, in order to restore balance. And that's why training in this type of thing needs to be thorough, and it needs to include the overlapping of influences that could cause someone to suffer, because that's just really key in understanding how to help someone. So in the shamanic understanding of illness, there's a spiritual influence for disease. There's a spiritual influence, not just an emotional influence, not just a physical or a biological influence. All of those things absolutely contribute to disease. But a shaman's role and a shaman's job is to look specifically at the spiritual influence. And again, we can't do that without without the guidance of the spirits who see way more than we do, and they just come through us human beings so that we can help other human beings. We don't take responsibility for the messages and the information that comes through. But a good shamanic healer, a good practitioner will take responsibility for the way it's delivered, how they help to integrate a person, and what kind of container they set for spirit to come through. So disease and imbalance and the influence, the spiritual influence on disease and imbalance. That's what I want to share about as we move into talking about ancestral healing, because ancestral healing is part of a larger body of healing work that happens through shamanic peoples. So a couple of different causes for imbalance or power loss or disease from a shamanic perspective. One of the causes is energetic intrusions. Not going to go into what causes them. I do that in another segment, but intrusions that come into the field that cause energy blockages. That is one of the things that causes imbalance. Power loss due to fragmentation of the soul energy. That is another thing that causes disease and imbalance. Possessing energies that are interfering with a person's ability to function. That's another thing that's addressed by a shaman or a shamanic practitioner. Being disconnected from spirit. That is another cause for disease and imbalance, as well as disruption or trauma that has happened in somebody's ancestral lineage. And that's today's topic. So today's topic of ancestral healing is part of a larger topic of healing that shamanic peoples do for their people and their communities. I like to chunk this out one piece at a time because there's a lot of information to bring through and to share. And this isn't something that like I learned in a weekend workshop. This is something that I learned over years and years of listening to the spirits and offering myself of service to my people and the community. And so I bring to you all of that. And it takes some time to lay it all out, right? So little pieces, bite-sized pieces. Hey there, Terry, thanks for joining us. And whether you're joining me live here right now or watching the replay, say hello, let me know how you're doing, ask questions. I really enjoy coming on and sharing this information. And the more you ask questions, the more information comes through. So ancestral healing, part of a larger scope of healing in shamanic practices. And why is it important? You may be hearing it a lot right now, ancestral healing, ancestral practices, things like that. And it's important because to bring balance on the planet, individually and collectively, we're really recognizing how much those two are interrelated, right? We need to look at the influence of our past. We don't need to get stuck in it. We don't need to relive it. We don't need to stay there, but we need to look at the influence of our past. We need to engage with healthy ancestors and the power that they have to guide us. And we need to make good on harm that's been done in the past. That's why ancestral healing is really important right now. Global reparation, global repairs are needed right now to heal the collective. That's not an opinion of mine, that's just a fact. And if you ask any shamanic practitioner or shamanic healer or shamanic world leader, they're going to tell you that global reparations are needed to help and heal the collective. Now, on a mini level, this makes sense because you have relationships. Shamanic practices a lot to do with relationships, and we have relationships all the time, right? You have relationships with your friends, your family members, and if you make a mistake and you hurt someone, in your family or in your friend circle, in order to move forward, you need to say you're sorry, and you need to say, what can I do to make up for it? Or something along those lines, right? Does that make sense? Give me an emoji if that makes sense. When you've got something that it went wrong, or something that you did to harm a friend or family member, you want to make good and clear up your mistake and clear the air with them, right? That is, on a mini level, what we need to do in the macro. In order to move forward, we need to make reparations on a collective level. And the reparations are not just here in the year 2020, although we've got plenty of reparations to do here in the year 2020. The reparations are on an ancestral level. And in order to be in a relationship with the ancestors, we need to actually communicate with them. Something is very, very, very lost, misguided, misunderstood, and completely not present in the mainstream, whitewashed, power-driven, money-hungry culture. It just isn't happening. And it needs to happen. And that's part of why it's coming through. So in order to be in relationship with the ancestors, we need to communicate with them. Indigenous peoples are already doing this all the time as part of a lifestyle, as part of a way to be in the world. There's a place at the table for the ancestors. There's altars set up to honor the ancestors. There's active engagement with those who have gone before as a normal part of life. Remember when I said, and you probably hear me say this often if you're around a lot, shamanic practice has a lot to do with relationships, and specifically the give and the take, the back and the forth, the ask and the listen in relationships. And when you have that kind of relationship with your ancestors, you get information that you need, and everything flows a lot better. And if you think about it, anybody, if you think about just a family structure, how you have kids, parents, grandparents, doesn't matter the gender, kids, parents, grandparents. When there's a grandparent's influence, a healthy grandparent, unfortunately, we have a lot of them. Not to deny the unhealthy ones, but we have a lot of healthy grandparents. And the grandparents' influence on a family can be really solid and strong and help to guide a family and support a family as they move forward. And that's because you're leaning into the wisdom of what's gone before. When you lean into your grandparents are sharing with you based on what they know, based on what their grandparents told them, based on what their grandparents shared with them, and then back and back and back. Your grandparents connect you to your ancestors. And connecting with your ancestors, whether or not you have grandparents here in the flesh, is similar to having grandparents that support you on a regular basis. I think that's the easiest way to describe it. How's everybody doing out there? All right, good. It makes sense. Yep. Thanks for your response. Sometimes it's hard to know what's happening when I can see your faces. So ancestors is a foundational part of life. That's just a given. That is part of the cycle of life. We need to learn how to do that better. It's time for that. So 2 ways that I see the need for, actually, I'll just give you 2 ways that I engage with doing ancestor work and the healing work and the one-on-one work that I do and in the community work. And then after that, I'll share with you a little bit about how you can engage with your own ancestors in general, and then more specifically for healing if you choose to. So 2 ways that I see the need for ancestral healing work in the work that I do. The first way is more along the lines of an individual experience that somebody in a person's ancestry, lost my train of thought, it happens sometimes. Individual ancestral disruption in a person's lineage, a big collective ancestral something that happened in someone's lineage. Both of those things make themselves apparent in the healing work that I do. So wounds from many generations past influence the present. And if you're not familiar, or if you want to look up like a scientific point of view for this, look up epigenetics, and you'll find how there's genetic memory in the DNA, and it gets passed on to people without the people having any physical interface with the information. So wounds from many generations back are present in an individual who comes for healing work, but they don't necessarily know that there's something back in the generations that is coming through them. That's one way that I do that. The healing work happens on an ancestral level. Another way that healing work happens on an ancestral level is when there are large wounds, like genocides and massacres of people that have occurred in the lineage. When that's another thing that comes through for healing. And once again, it may not be that a person has physically encountered a massacre or genocide, but the memory of what happened to their people or what their people have done is held, and it comes through like a hiccup for a person, and it needs to be addressed. Anytime power was taken, that is remembered in the DNA. And so the small wounds and the large wounds, and I'll give you an example of both in a minute. The small wounds and the large wounds both hold people back because power was taken or power got stuck. Energy got stuck, and it holds people back. And I'm talking about everybody, all people, both the perpetrators and the perpetrated. We have, in a wide variety of people, depending on your cultural, racial identity, you have in your lineage experienced being perpetrated, being massacred, being traumatized. Or your people have experienced being the perpetrators, both of which hold trauma. Whether you are the perp or you receive the perpetration, there's trauma there. And so we have it coming through all peoples in different ways. And we need to acknowledge this. We need to do the right thing so that we can move on. That's part of the reason why there's such an emphasis on ancestral healing right now. Because in order to, we need to address it to move on. And it's happening all over. It's happening in many ways. There are ancestral reparations that are going on. There are groups that go to different sites here just in North America and South America, on all continents. Groups that have the healing intention, and shamanic groups that go to sites where massacres and genocides happened, and they do ceremony and healing work to change the relationship with the energy that's there, and essentially to change the energy of the imprint of the trauma. They go there and they do their attempt to make good, to change things. People are re-walking walks like the Trail of Tears, which was a horrific example of how people were massacred. They're re-walking that and rewriting different pathways where people were traumatized back in the generations to change the way we operate as a result of that story. We cannot change the past, but we can change its influence on us. And individuals are also doing their own work around this. So we've got this going on, ancestral healing happening on an individual level, and we have it going on a collective level and a bigger level. And so to bring balance, power needs to be restored. Shamanic folks do this through ceremony, through connecting with spirit, listening, and that gives us the ability to work with trauma from the past. Shamanic peoples don't adhere to linear time. The rules that apply in this modern, illusionary, somewhat fabricated culture, I hope that isn't offensive, don't apply in shamanic practices. So we go back in time to heal, and we honor the ancestors as if they are alive on another plane. We don't look at them as dead and gone. We look at them as being alive on another plane. And so many are called to do this ancestral work so that ancestors can be freed. The ones that were hurt and traumatized, and the ones who also did the hurting and the traumatization, both need to be freed, because the imprint that is that occurred because of the trauma in the lineages is gotten to a point of we're at critical mass with it, and we need to shift it in order to move on. There's a lot of things that we need to shift in our world. The way we treat the environment, the way that we treat people, the way that we look at abuse, all those things in the here and now need to shift. And at the same time, we need to do some shifting and some healing work on the past so that we can change the future. So the ancestral healing work happens so that ancestors can be freed, so that we can engage with healthy ancestors and have them on our side. All the energy that's tied in knots throughout history begins to come loose when we do this work. When there is generational trauma, it ties knots in the energy field, in the collective energy field of people and in our memory. And when we do healing work, we untie those knots and loosen up that energy. And so that's another reason why we do this work. So we do this work so the ancestors can be freed. We do this work so we can be free. We do this work so we can engage with healthy ancestors. We do this work so that the energy that's tied in knots throughout history is unknotted. And we do this work so that we can stop abusing marginalized groups of people, because that's exactly what we're doing here on this planet, and that needs to stop. And we do that in many ways, but from an ancestral point of view, this healing work creates a shift there so that we can bring the power balance back between the people. So how's this all landing? All right, we've got Leah in the house. Hey there, thanks for joining us. So if you're just joining us now, I'm talking about ancestral healing. In my experience working, ancestral healing comes through when I do shamanic work because it influences a person. Oh, gosh, sometimes it's hard to explain this. When we do healing work, there can be individual trauma that happened back in the generations, or there can be a big collective trauma that has happened that affects a person. And people don't always know that that's what's affecting them. I'll give you an example. I shared this in one of my classes yesterday. One of the clients that I have who, and this is an example of a personal trauma in her ancestral line. She had a physical wound that wouldn't heal. She had a surgery on something that wouldn't heal, and no matter what she did. She was a yoga teacher, a coach, a therapist, did all the right things, lived a really healthy life, and she had a simple medical procedure and it just wouldn't heal, and she knew something was wrong. She thought she had a curse, and it turns out that there was deep ancestral wounding that was still in process that needed to be healed. And when we did that healing work that had to do with, I think, her mother's line and grieving a baby that had died in the line, that wasn't properly grieved because the mother didn't know it was dead. It was a very intense, complicated situation. And as soon as we did that, the healing work that Spirit had prescribed, her physical ailments shifted, her wounds healed, and she went on with her life. And then she wound up telling me that after the fact, that a few psychics had told her that she had this deep, deep grief happening. And she had no understanding of what that meant. But when we went into this work, we could see that there was indeed somebody on her mother's line who was in the middle of, who was actually not able to grieve. And that was coming through her, most likely because it comes through the people who can heal it. And the people who can heal it don't necessarily know what's happening, but they're drawn to a healer or a process or a ceremony that can guide them and help them. And that's how the medicine gets through. That's how energy moves. Anyway, there's a lot of people who are allowing healing work to move through without consciously knowing that they're healing things. So that's happening. The other example of how ancestral healing happens is that when there is a big trauma that happens, a massacre, when we're talking about the enslavement of people from Africa, when we're talking about First Nations, Indigenous people here who had their lands taken and who were essentially killed at the hands of white folks, that kind of trauma also comes through to a person. And it isn't necessarily something that someone consciously knows, or maybe it is something that they consciously know. Either way, there's a memory that happens, and there's healing work that comes up and asks to be done. Give you one example of what that looks like. A nurse that I worked with a while ago was wanting to do some healing work, and she lived a pretty basic life. Nothing extraordinary ever happened to her. She had no physical or emotional outstanding trauma in her life, in her growing up. And she didn't understand why she had this deep, deep sadness inside of her. So we started to do some of this work, and she had been wondering why she couldn't access her joy. And what Spirit showed me through the spirit eyes, not through my decision of what needed to happen, was that there was a little girl that was in a concentration camp that was involved in the genocide of her people. And that girl came to me, and we did some healing work for that girl. And after that healing work was done, my client, the nurse, had the feeling of sadness lifted, and it never came back. And so that's an example of how someone can feel the effects of generational trauma, but not really know why they're feeling it. So the good news is that people are becoming wise to this, and healing work is happening both in individual ways, like I do with my clients, and in bigger ways where there's ceremony that's being offered to bring reparations or to do repair work on all levels. And so there we have it. That is a tidbit in as short of a time as I could give you about ancestral healing. I talked about in the beginning, and go back if you are just catching this now, I talked about a little bit about shamanic practice, the goal of shamanic practice, the multiple techniques and things that shamanic peoples do that have to do with healing, ancestral healing just being one part of it, the need for ancestral healing, why we're doing it, and why it needs to continue to happen, and why it's happening now. I covered all of that. Take a breath. How's everybody doing out there? Okay, great. All right, making sense. So if you're wanting to start a process where you're being more in communication with your ancestors, and possibly want to do your own ancestral healing work, but don't even know how to start or what that would be about, a couple things that you can do. I invite you to look into your own ancestry Now, if you are a marginalized person, if you are a Black or a brown person, person of color, you've already done this work. You've already looked into the wounds and the trauma that was done by the white folks. So this isn't necessarily for you. Although anybody can do this work. My invitation is to look into your ancestry and look into the places that aren't pretty. If you come from a racial identity or a culture where your people were perpetrators, and I know people don't want to talk about this, but we need to, take a look at what wasn't pretty. Just take a look at it. Start taking a look at it. And recognize that within that, there has been some damage that has been done by your people. There's been damage that's been done by my people. Start to look at that. We'll leave that there for right now. That is a big way to begin ancestral healing. Another way is to find folks who are doing this type of healing. Either individual folks who are doing individual work or folks who are doing group ceremonial work. I know there's a Mohawk elder that was here recently in my region in Western, on the East Coast in Western Mass, who was doing ancestral healing work. There's also a lot of folks who were trained by Malidoma Some, who comes from the Dogger tribe in Africa, and they do ancestral healing work. Malidoma Some brought a big piece of work here. He and his former wife, who is now deceased, Sabanfu, brought a lot of work here in the 90s to help people to do ancestral healing work and grieving work. So look into some of that. Another way that you can start doing ancestral healing work is to light a candle to honor your ancestors. Not just your recent ancestors, but your older ancestors. Light a candle to honor them. Light a candle to honor the devastation that occurred because of your ancestors. Light a candle for the healing of your ancestors. Those are all things that you can do. And if you journey, if you do shamanic journey, you can journey for more instructions on how to begin or continue an ancestral healing process. Ancestral healing is not just needed. It's not just something we need on the planet. It's something that is happening and it is in process right now. This is why we're seeing a lot of what we're seeing on the planet right now, is because we are in process with it. And all we can do is continue the process and continue by engaging consciously in the process. That's the gift that we have through the blessings of these teachings that are coming through from Indigenous peoples. And it's a large part of the work that's happening right now. And whether you're consciously engaged in ancestral healing or not, you're feeling the effects of all of it. So if you are, I'll pop on, I'll look and see if there's any questions here. And I'll answer them. I know there's a 20-second lag, so I have to wait a little bit to hear from you. But if you're interested in how this work might help you personally, I work with healers who are doing big work to move forward, and we uncover some of the stuff that I'm talking about as we do the big work. Because as healers do work on themselves, they're healing their lineages. And boy, is it time for that. So you can always reach out and schedule a free breakthrough session with me to talk about what it might look like for you. Just be aware that energy moves very fast here. So only reach out if that's what you're looking for. Big shift. All right. Any questions on ancestral healing? Leah says she's been feeling this energy. Yeah. There's a lot happening in the collective, and it's not so hard to tap in and to feel the pulse on that these days because the veils are so thin. Yeah, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. If you're catching this halfway through or at the end, please go back to the beginning. I talked about ancestral healing as a part of a larger healing system in shamanic practices. It's all about restoring power. We need to take a look, and we are taking a look at how we can bring balance and do repair work, both for the people who were traumatized and also for the people who did the traumatizing. All of it is coming in and coming into play right now. All right, thanks so much. That's this episode of Healers in Healing. I hope you have a beautiful, beautiful day. Bye for now.